Merci d'être venu pour le symposium sur collectionner Cezanne.
Thank you very much for joining us for this afternoon session on collecting Cezanne. I am Daniella, Luxembourg. I am administrator for the Courtauld Collection Institute of Art, and I'm here to moderate this afternoon debate. Collecting Cezanne has always been a radical gesture and very contemporary. Jasper Jones has very much followed the work of Cezanne, who has more than 20-odd works of Cezanne in his collection. Bridget Riley, David Hawkney have also followed in footsteps of Cezanne. And it's for this reason that it is such an honor for us to have a contemporary art critic who has written a number of works on David Hockney and Van Gogh, and who has also accepted the role as moderator for this art, Martin Gayford. By his side, we have Walter Feilchenfeldt, who is the co-author of the Logical Inventory for Cezanne online. And as of this year, January, it is open to the public via an online website. It is no longer a hardback catalogue. He is also head of the Feilchenfeldt series of books. We also have Philippe Cézanne. It is our great honor to have him here with us. He is the grandson of Paul Cézanne. Thank you very much for being here with us this afternoon.
Ernst Vegelin.
We have Ernst Vegelin, director of the Courtauld Gallery. He will be speaking to us about the Courtauld Collection.
Lukas Gloor.
A round of applause. We also have Lukas Gloor, who is here on behalf of the Bührle collection in Zurich. And we have elements of that collection in the Mayol Museum here in Paris. With these people here representing collectioners of Cezanne, we will now move into the debate, and I think it's a fantastic debate. But before we do so, I would like to thank the Louis Vuitton Foundation, Jean-Paul Claerbergen, Suzanne Paget, and Adeline Scherf. I would like to thank them for making this possible.
Can everyone hear? It's delightful to be here on the occasion of this great exhibition. And as Daniella just said, I'm going to be the moderator, and I'd also like to say, first of all, my apologies for speaking in English, and also a word of explanation that I'm here in the guise of an art critic, and also in the slightly ambiguous position which some of the people I'll be talking about in a moment found themselves in, of being friend, advocate, and supporter of the artist. And it's from a mentor of mine, an older art critic who was gave me a lot of wise advice at one point, the late David Sylvester. I want to start off this discussion by borrowing one of David's ideas, which I would take as a starting point. David would say that for the art game, the game of art as we now play it in the modern age, 5 players are required. They are the artist, the dealer, the collector, the curator, and the writer, of whom the last, I might say, of whom I'm a representative myself, is by, and David was as well, no doubt the most insignificant by some way. But I want to slightly complicate David's idea by adding that all of these players in the game are capable of occupying at least 2 of the other positions. So I'm going to briefly discuss, and we'll be discussing later on, artist collectors and dealer collectors and collectors who are also curators. All of those types exist and are very important, I think. I'm going to start off, though, with the story of one picture. This picture, which is mountains in Provence, sometimes known as the barrage, or identified as the barrage François Zola, a dam which was designed by the novelist's father. As this is a demonstration of the fact that paintings, pictures have their own fates and their own biographies. This picture was painted perhaps around 1879. It found its way into the showroom of one of the people we will perhaps discuss briefly in a moment, who was Père Tanguy, who was a dealer and also a seller of art supplies, and more than that, a sort of saint and angel and helper of artists. And he had an arrangement with Cezanne whereby Cezanne could have art materials, paints and canvas on credit, and he would display works in his window. He had a similar arrangement with Van Gogh a few years later on. And in the window of his shop, Paul Gauguin saw that painting which I showed you just now, Mountains in Provence. It was one of a number of Cezannes which Gauguin bought. But Gauguin was one of the very first people we could call a collector of Cezanne. This was during his period when he hadn't become a full-time artist himself, but was working in what we'd now call the financial services sector. And he loved his Cezannes dearly, in fact, possibly too dearly, because Cezanne eventually fell out with him, possibly because he felt he was stealing his ideas. It's a controversial point, but Cezanne would inveigh against Gauguin. After Gauguin was forced by financial circumstances to sell this picture, it went on the art market. It was seen by a young Welshman, a woman, Gwendolen Davies, in 1918 in Paris. She bought it with another Cezanne. It was after the great post-impressionist exhibitions arranged by Roger Fry we heard about this morning. It was one of the first Cezannes seen in Britain. In fact, the first to be seen in a public gallery. It was exhibited in Bath, where the teenage Kenneth Clark, later director of the National Gallery and prolific writer on art, saw it. It made a great impression on him, as did the other Cezanne. In 1922, it was shown in London at the Burlington Arts Club. It was seen by Samuel Courtauld in company with a young airman turned painter, ex-airman who'd fought in the First World War. They were going around the exhibition. The airman said in front of this, "Cezanne is a wonderful painter. He sends you this way, he sends you in the opposite direction. In the end, he sends you off the deep end." And Courtauld remembered, "At that point, I saw the magic. At that point, I saw the magic, and I never ceased to do so." So the point I want to make is that for many people, especially in those early days, understanding Cezanne was a sort of moment of conversion. It was almost like a religious moment. You suddenly got it. Sorry, I didn't. There's Courtauld, of course. I didn't move on to him. I now want to deal with the first of the categories I mentioned before. Again, we'll come back, but I want to talk about artist collectors. A few years ago at the National Gallery, there was an exhibition called Painters' Paintings, dealing with the collections of great artists. And a point that struck me at the time was the last 3 rooms were devoted to 3 artists, all of whom lived during or after Cezanne's lifetime. They were Degas, Matisse, and Lucian Freud. And the common factor between the collections of those three men, three great painters, was they each had at least one Cezanne. I think that's rather a telling point. First of all, this is one owned by Degas in the first. First of all, he bought it from Vollard, dealer who we will be coming back to in a moment, in 1895. It was one of subsequently a number of Cezannes in Degas' collection. Degas was, of course, one of the great painter, artist, collectors in history. But an interesting point about this is it's now owned by Jasper Johns. Now owned by Jasper, is one of those 22 Cezannes in Jasper Johns' collection, which Daniella mentioned, and that makes the point that Cezanne not only was a source of inspiration to artists, he continues to be, in the 21st century, an inspiration to living artists, including Jasper Johns, and also I'd like to slip in a mention of David Hockney, who's not an artist collector, but I don't know whether this has been publicized in France, but has been resident in France for the last 3 weeks and intends to continue to work in Normandy for a great deal of the future, of his future career. He's built a new studio near Honfleur, and he's started to work in France. And he, a few years ago, did a series of works based on the card players. Next, Matisse, another painter who eventually owned a number of works by Cezanne. This was the first one he bought in 1899, and rather like Courtauld, he had a moment of almost conversion, or what in English we call a coup de foudre. Namely, he saw it in Ambroise Vollard's gallery, and he couldn't get it out of his head. He came back. He said he remembered he went for walks in the country, and this picture, Three Bathers, would appear in his mind. He couldn't resist going back and offering to buy it. Vollard drove a typically hard bargain. He sold it for 1,500 francs, for which part payment of which he accepted 10 paintings by Matisse. And Matisse found the 500 francs extra quite hard to obtain at the time. Matisse, 37 years later, he wrote of this picture that it had been his talisman. It had sustained him morally in the most critical passages of his career, and that it was, in a way, it was the fountainhead of his art. It was certainly, one can see a lot of Matisse almost growing out of this picture. Lastly, one I know a little bit about myself, because I saw it appear on Lucian Freud's drawing room wall in the mid-1990s. Lucian wasn't, in his earlier days, a great collector because he spent all his money on horse racing and lost it in that way. However, by the mid-90s, when he was in his 70s and was earning quite a lot of money, his own work was becoming very valuable. His dealers being a crucial factor in not only in collecting but also in advising artists. His dealer, Bill Aquavela, noticed him leafing through a sales catalogue. Lucian said, "That looks rather nice." Bill Aquavela said, "I'll tell you what, Lucian, instead of giving all your money to the bookmakers, why don't you just buy it?" And Lucian bought it. It appeared, as I say, on his drawing room wall. It's Afternoon in Naples is an early painting from about 1877, tiny thing. And shortly afterwards, Lucian started an enormous painting after Cezanne, based on his little Cezanne, with live models recapitulating the pose of the composition of his own Cezanne. It's another demonstration of how Cezanne remains for many living painters a talisman, and I think it's what Picasso said, the father of us all. I'm now briefly going to mention, before we move on to the other speakers, the other categories I mentioned. The dealer, Amboise, voilà. Every great artist requires a great dealer to sustain and develop their career. For Cezanne, it was Voilà. For Picasso, Kahnweiler. For Jasper Johns, it was Leo Castelli, and so on. There is Cezanne's unfinished portrait of Voilà from 1899, of which he rather characteristically said, at the point he abandoned it, that he was not unhappy with the shirt front. That was one of the more positive remarks that Cezanne made about his own work. Voilà, his customer, Gertrude Stein, remarked that Cezanne was the romance of Vola's life. He dealt in many other artists, Van Gogh was one of them. However, he dealt in Cezanne to an extraordinary extent. He held the first major exhibition of Cezanne in 1895 in his gallery in Paris. He organized this at the Autumn Salon in 1904, a public display of 31 Cezannes, I think, all from his own collection, and Voilà also took this photograph. And he sold to, for example, Gertrude Stein and her brothers many pictures, starting with their first Cezanne, of which Gertrude Stein left a most amusing recollection of how they went to Vola's gallery, recommended by a man called Charles Leusse, an American living in Florence, who discovered Cezanne. Not many people at that stage knew about him. And they said that we'd like a small landscape like the one Leusse has. And then Voilà went away and got first a still life. They said, no, that's not what we want. He went away, another long pause, came back with a bather. Said, no, that's not what we want. And this went on. Eventually, he produced what they want, whether this was cunning or a strategy. But anyway, they were hooked. And you can see one of the Cezannes, which we'll be seeing again, I think on the wall above Gertrude Stein. That's Alice B. Toklas in the other seat. That's the picture in question. I now want to deal with the category of the artists, the writer, collector. Victor Choquet is not really a writer. He was more a lover, an admirer, a fellow spirit of artists, especially close to Cezanne, for whom he sat on many occasions. This is just one of the great portraits of Choquet. But on one occasion, when Cezanne was particularly savagely attacked by the critics at the exhibition, Impressionist exhibition of 1877, Choquet burst into print, defending him and saying that he was, in his opinion, like a Greek of the great period. And the people criticizing Cezanne's bathers reminded him of barbarians attacking the Parthenon. Two more. Geoffroy, the critic who was the first one to write a substantial piece on Gauguin. As I say, I rather sympathize and understand with the position of the critic, who's also the supporter than the advocate of the artist. And this is another abandoned painting, abandoned, I think, in the critic's house, which is why he ended up with it. Critics and writers can end up rather accidentally being collectors. Lastly, Joachim Gasquet, son of a friend of the artist, and one of the people, a poet and a writer, one of the people who transmitted Cézanne's thoughts and ideas. So a lot of what we know about him comes from writings by people like Gasquet and Bernard from his last few years. And this, again, an unfinished portrait. Now, 3 curator collectors or collector curators. Hugo von Tschudi, a Swiss curator who worked for the Berlin galleries and also in Munich for the Bavarian state collections. The first person to buy a Cézanne for a state museum in 1897, I think. And a person of great insight, advised, by the way, by a painter, Max Liebermann, and subsequently he was sacked from his role in Berlin for displaying a Gauguin, not for displaying a Cézanne. He moved to Munich, and he bought himself a number of pictures, of which this great self-portrait is one, which he then presented to the Munich State Collection. So there you have the curator who is also a visionary collector. We'll come on later when Lukas is talking about Swiss collectors to talk about Oskar Reinhardt, one of the great, like Samuel Courtauld, collectors whose private collection turned into a public institution. We should mention Albert Barnes, the greatest of all private collectors of Cezanne, whose collection then turned into a public institution. That being his very greatest work, perhaps and the most extraordinary and wildest and extreme of the Cezanne large bathers. You can see it, I think, just behind him in that photograph. And finally, Emil Bührle, who will be the subject of particularly of Lukas's contributions. So with that, I'm going to stop talking myself and start asking questions. So Walter, you first. Could you tell us something about the early collectors of Cezanne, and particularly this close association between Cezanne and fellow artists in... I think it's on.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Cezanne was an artist who interested his colleagues very much. And the reason is quite simple. He was just a very artisty artist. He liked to develop new ways of doing paintings. And that's what all his colleagues were interested in. And his great friend was first Pissarro, with whom he worked together in the 70s in Paris. And there he was very much under Pissarro's influence at the beginning. And the only thing where Pissarro was really quite good was his still lifes, and Cezanne tried to imitate them. And then he did this wonderful still life with the soup bowl, which is in the Musée d'Orsay, which he gave to Pissarro, sort of saying, now I can do it as well as you. And then he became this great still life painter, which is unreached. But that was not at the beginning so. And the other artists that liked him was, for instance, Monet. Monet was at that time the sort of the richest of the colleagues. And there's this famous event when Cézanne went to Giverny and went to lunch with Monet, and Monet introduced him to his friends, and he said, look, this is Cézanne, he is the greatest of us all. And Cézanne was offended. He thought he made fun of him, and he left. And he left Giverny, and he left 2 pictures behind, which many, many years later were found in the attic of the Auberge, and are now recognized as genuine Cézanne's. But for many years, nobody knew about these pictures. And Gauguin bought Cézanne's, and later Picasso and Matisse. And all these artists feel that he is their father. And why do they feel that? Because Cézanne invented a new way of painting, which was essential for all these artists, as far as Lucian Freud and Jasper Johns.
And I think, am I right in thinking that it was in the early stages, it was painters who pointed out to other people, such as, I think Choquet was directed towards Cézanne by Renoir.
Oh, that's right. Yes, that's quite correct.
So first of all artists, and then a few very rare collectors such as Choquet. Would you like to say a little more about Choquet?
Choquet, you have really said everything about him. There's nothing much to say about him, except that he was absolutely fascinated by these paintings, and he bought, as far as I remember, bathers, which he didn't dare to take home because of his wife. And he had to leave it, I think, with Renoir, until he had convinced her that he would bring this very strange picture home. And it was a challenge to buy a Cézanne and to hang it up. But still, these people were in love with the art, and they did it.
And could you expand on the role of Vollard at How Crucial? I understand something like...
Vollard was a person who liked artists. He was extremely rude to collectors, but he liked artists, and he liked Degas a lot. I don't really know much about his relationship to Cézanne, because he didn't see Cézanne very much. He had all his business relations with the son, but he liked to handle artists well and to treat the clients miserably. He always did this, what you mentioned before, that he would show them something and then take it away again and not show them what they wanted to have. And then they would come the next day and say, I would like to buy it. And he said, no, it's not available anymore. He was very, very rude to the
sales strategy. Earlier on in conversation, Walter drew I thought, interesting distinction between two kinds of dealers: the kind who like collectors and get on with collectors, don't get on with artists, and the kind who get on with artists but not with collectors. So
I'm, of course, best informed about Paul Cézanne in Germany. And we have to realize that when we saw this 1910 exhibition in London, in Berlin, they started around the turn of the century. The first Cézanne exhibition at Cassiers, with all the Choquet paintings which he got from Vollard on consignment, was in 1900. And he had many exhibitions before there was the first one in London. And in Berlin, it was very clearly the David Sylvester set up, that there was the museum man, Tschudi, the collector, Max Liebermann, the dealer, Cassirer, the critic, Meyer Graefe, and am I missing?
The writer, yes. Yeah, I think
the writer,
yes,
that was
yes.
Meyer Graefe. Meyer Graefe wrote this book in 1904 called Die Entwicklungsgeschichte der modernen Malerkunst. That was the Bible for all these Germans. They all read it, and he just says such clever things about Cézanne. It's quite amazing. And Cézanne was so furious when Berlin bought that painting in 1897, saying, now Paris will never, ever buy a Cézanne from now that the one is in Berlin in the museum.
Why do you think that in the German-speaking world, Cézanne was, relatively speaking, understood so quickly?
It was not only Cézanne, it was also Van Gogh. It was also the Impressionists. It was also very much Manet, and they sold the entire Pèlerin group of Manets in three-share business. It was Bernard-Jeune, Durand-Ruel, and Cassirer, but they were all sold in Berlin at that time. And they showed the Grande Baigneuse by Cézanne, which is now in Philadelphia. They showed about 1900 in the secession in Berlin. Berlin could have bought all these pictures, and Berlin had, I know it by Van Gogh, they had 127 Van Goghs in private collections in Germany in 1914, and now they have about 5 left in the museums. So if there hadn't been these two wars, the German collections would have been absolutely superb.
Yes, a lot went. Moving on, because the occasion of this conversation is this great exhibition of the Courtauld Collection here. You said as we went round the exhibition yesterday evening that you thought Samuel Courtauld's array of Cezannes was a particularly powerful and beautiful edit, so to speak. Oh, would you like to expand on that?
I would say that nowadays this group of pictures of Cezanne is about the finest I can think of. And he has something about every kind, except the bathers. I'll talk about that a bit later. But they have, for instance, this wonderful card player painting. And the card players of this same work, there are 3 versions. And the first one was 1912, I think you said this morning. It was at the Louvre from Camondo, Gift of Camondo. And the one which is Courtauld, and I think this is so lovely, was offered to Oskar Reinhardt before it was offered by Alfred Gold in 1929. Before it was offered to Courtauld, it was offered to Oskar Reinhardt. And Alfred Gold writes in the letter, it is far better than the Orsay than the Camondo version. And there's a handwriting of Oskar Reinhardt next to it, nonsense. And this is so typical that Oskar Reinhardt, with his traditional mind, he had France in his mind, and he was thinking, if there is the one at Camondo, it must be much better, and I'm not going to buy it. Whereas for Courtauld, it was just the opposite. He thought, the French have one, so I have to have one too. And he bought it, and it's a masterpiece. I like it better than the first one. And the third version was the one that Pellerin had. That was still in France at the time. And Pellerin, when he died, left it to his son Victor, and he sold it to Wildenstein, or Wildenstein sold it for him to Empiricos. And as we know, now it's in Qatar. It's the great version. But for me, perhaps the finest of them all is the one with Courtauld. And the one at Courtauld, which I love most, and which I would take if I had to save one Cezanne, is the Lac d'Annecy. I think this is a picture that goes far beyond landscape painting. It is a modern painting constructed in the way 20th century artists like to construct their paintings. And this is the link why the modern artists like Cezanne so much. And that's what I'm going to work about now that the catalogue raisonnée is finished, and that gives us now the material to start our work on Cezanne, Andreas. and that's...
Well, lastly, before we move on to talk a bit more about Samuel Courtauld, I wondered if you'd like to say a word about collecting a specific aspect. You were picking out the watercolour still life last night as the most beautiful example of that type of work, of that period. I wondered if you'd like to say something about, say, collecting work on paper or collecting a...
The still, in my opinion, the Courtauld still life, the large one, is of this group of about 10, the most impressive, the most beautiful one. And they are quite late in Cezanne's life, and they are very complete, and that's what he really, he did great sheets of paper with lots of colors. And the fact that it's a still life is not the important point of it. The fact that it's a large sheet with a lot of color. And as far as the whole group of watercolors is concerned, that he did really, really many hundreds of watercolors of landscapes. And one wonders really why he did that. And I come more and more to the conclusion that it was just too early for him to do the step to become abstract. A generation later, they started doing abstract art. And then no landscape was done anymore. you must really realize that after this First World War, there is hardly any landscape painting.
Until David Hockney comes.
Until David Hockney, but he started with portraits.
Yes.
Anyhow, it's a very interesting thing to study these hundreds and hundreds of landscape watercolors, and in the end, they are not about landscape. They're about art. They're about creating a piece of paper and doing some art, some composition on it. But the fact that they are trees is totally immaterial. They are not really trees. They are rubber sort of thing. It's amazing. And I have to work on this. I'm very much on my mind at the moment.
Well, that's fascinating. At this point, I'm going to bring in Ernst, who I think is going to say something about the rather unusual level of resistance to what we call post, or what Roger Fry called post-impressionism for us in Britain. Is that?
Martin, thank you. I very much enjoyed what you both had to say. I want to weave in a few more things to the question of artist collectors and artists inspired by Cezanne. I would add Richard Serra. We did an exhibition with Richard Serra at the Courtauld a few years ago, and he spoke very powerfully about the Cezanne still life with plaster Cupid, which is in the exhibition downstairs, and explained that he had for perhaps 2 decades next to his bed a little postcard of that painting. And that for him this was an absolute touchstone. This was conceptually the door that had opened for him that he walked through. So I think that there are many examples like that. In terms of English collectors, I think the point has been made that England comes very, very late to Cezanne. In fact, England, as we know, comes very late to modern French painting, full stop. There is, of course, a good deal of modern French art coming to England from the time of the Franco-Prussian War. Artists are going, Pissarro and Monet and dealers are going, particularly Durand-Ruel. Cezanne actually isn't shown in England really at all until 1905, when Durand-Ruel puts on a huge exhibition of French Impressionist paintings in London, 315 works, I think, and 10 Cezannes are included in that show. I think afterwards he sort of gives up on England and decides to focus on America a bit more. 10 Cezannes are included in that exhibition. But Cezanne is not really written about at that point. But then relatively soon afterwards, he moves, he's repositioned from being a sort of minor impressionist artist into a sort of radical standard bearer for the avant-garde in England. And the role of Roger Fry, as we've already heard, is absolutely central to that project. Roger Fry's 1910 exhibition, Manet and the Post-Impressionist, has, I think, 21 Cezannes in it. The second Post-Impressionist exhibition has, I think, 10 Cezannes. I think Anna is sort of shaking her head a little bit. The figures may be a bit dodgy, but I think at that point he is starting to be positioned as sort of the father of the avant-garde in the way that English critics perceive him. The first Cezanne doesn't seem to have been owned by an English collector until 1911, I think, and that is Michael Sadler, the educationalist, who was a sort of a correspondent of Courtauld's and a friend to a degree. He owns a painting called La Maison Abandonnée. And then the following year, a Manchester businessman of German descent called Herbert Kuhlmann owns the plaster Cupid still life that I've just referred to. Coming back to the picture that you showed, Martin, of the Davies sisters' landscape in Provence, could you show us that on the screen? It's the next one, I think. Perhaps it's gone. So that landscape, as we heard, is is shown in an art gallery in the town of Bath in 1918. It is then offered on loan to the Tate Gallery, and the Tate Gallery refuses it. And that is it becomes a sort of cause célèbre in England, and it pitches the traditionalists against the avant-garde into a very public and quite intemperate and aggressive debate at times. Roger Fry says at that point, a gallery of modern foreign art without Cezanne is like a gallery of Florentine art without Giotto. So he is absolutely at the heart of how they see Cezanne. And as Martin said, it's that picture that Courtauld sees the following year in 1922 and says, I felt the magic and I felt it ever since. That year, 1922, the Tate Gallery changes its mind and decides, after all, to accept the painting on loan and to exhibit it. But the first painting isn't acquired by an English National Museum until 1925, when through the Courtauld Fund, they very appropriately buy a Cezanne self-portrait. Courtauld goes on to buy 11 paintings and also watercolors and letters, and his support of Cezanne and his advocacy breaks down all opposition to the artist. And I just want to end by saying that in 1934, he offers to lend his Montagne Saint-Victoire to the National Gallery, where his friend Kenneth Clark is now director. Kenneth Clark had seen this picture as a young man and was completely bouleversé by it, knocked sideways. And Courtauld says, would you like to borrow my Montagne Saint-Victoire? And Kenneth Clark says, we'd absolutely love to borrow it, but there is one note, he says, and this is what he says, I think it is necessary as a measure, especially with Cezanne, to have the painting glazed, to put glass in front of the painting, because it is just possible that some enraged diehard might try to assault it. So even in 1934, the director of the National Gallery is telling one of his major patrons, you never know with Cezanne, let's just play it safe and put some glass in front of it, because the English, they're a little bit strange sometimes.
Yes, and in 1964, when the National Gallery bought its large Bathers, which would now be regarded as one of the great masterpieces of the collection, there was a lot of fuss in the newspapers because it was too expensive, £400,000. I just wondered, Ernst, whether you'd agree with the proposition that it was Courtauld's Cezannes which were the heart of the collection. Does that make sense?
I think that is the case, just in quantity, but also in the depth of commitment, and above all, I think, in the nature of the engagement with the pictures. So it really, Courtauld, as we've heard, was not a cerebral man. He wasn't an intellectual. He wasn't buying systematically. He didn't have a sort of catalogue in his mind. He bought what he loved, what he felt passionate about, what he connected with on a personal level. So it was really intuitive and emotional. And the word magic, I think, is really important to understand the broader aim that Courtauld had. Of course, for him, what he wanted to do was to have art play a profound role in society, in rebalancing society, which he felt had become too materialistic and had lost its core spiritual values. And I think Cezanne somehow, for him, was the ideal artist to do that with, because he was an artist for which one didn't need any learning, one didn't need art history, one didn't need theory. This was an artist that he had experienced deeply and profoundly on an emotional, intuitive level, and I think his hope was that other people would be able to do the same. So he was sort of the battering ram, in a sense.
And following on from that, would you say that it's true, seems to me perhaps it's true that in Britain, in London, we still see Impressionism, post-Impressionism, through Samuel Courtauld's choice, through his editing, what he decided we ought to see in the National Gallery and the Courtauld Gallery is what we still see. And perhaps there are other versions of that world, but does that seem right to you?
Yes, I'm sure that's right. I think just in terms of the quantity and the quality of the contribution that Courtauld makes to the collection in England, his own private collection now at the Courtauld Gallery, which is the greatest collection of Impressionists in England, and then the works that he acquires through the Courtauld Fund for the National Gallery, I think that is just at the heart of the matter in England. And certainly other collectors have added to that, but it's inescapably Courtauld's vision. And it's also, to a degree, a very French story, of course. I mean, it is a profoundly French interpretation of art in the 19th and early 20th century. That canon was very much shaped by Roger Fry. And it's something I think that the collections, the national collections, are now grappling with. How do we tell a broader story from Scandinavia and the Netherlands and Germany above all? So it's a very particular story, but it is a fantastic story.
Well, at that point, I'd like to bring in Philippe Cézanne, and we're going to do something slightly unorthodox, which is I'm going to speak in English and he's going to speak in French. And I think Philippe is going to say something about the reception and the obstacles which his great-grandfather found in his native land during his lifetime. I think it's on.
At the beginning, I would say that, you know, Cézanne était incompris parce que
Cezanne at the beginning was misunderstood. His vision of art, well, let's just say he didn't color within the lines. He broke away from long-standing traditions. He painted for the sake of painting. He didn't see the subject as a story. And for a long time, up until the 1960s, I would say, Cezanne was misunderstood, in France at the very least. At the end of the day, France is a rather traditional country. It's a little complicated to color outside the line. It's a little complicated to think outside the box. And this is why the initial collectors started out in Germany, in Russia, in the US, and elsewhere, not in France.
I wonder if you could say something about, do you have a sense of how your family responded to the responsibility of having produced this great artist who was suddenly very famous and whose reputation and the development of his fame really rested on the family?
D'abord, mon grand-père, donc le fils de Paul Cézanne.
My grandpa, son of Paul Cézanne, took care of his father very early on because all the painter worried about was painting. And curiously, what Renoir used to say is that Cézanne is the man who takes the longest to make a work of art. And once he's done, he loses interest and shoves it in the corner. So my grandfather worked with Vollard and other art dealers. He took care of selling the works, and after his father died, he decided to close the studio where Cézanne had spent his last 4 years. And he brought back to Paris all of the equipment, the familiar objects. He closed the studio and said, I will never go back to Aix, because the local residents don't like us. And it's true, he never actually did go back to Aix. His childhood friend was Jean Renoir. And he used to go to Cannes, which was nearby. In the First World War, he spent some time in Toulon and in Marseille in the south of France, where he met young painters such as Rouault and others. And in Paris, Oh my, he came under pressure very quickly, or rather he still had a few paintings in storage, and he was under pressure to take part and showcase these works in major exhibitions, particularly starting in 1936. He was asked to be part of the organizing committee. He knew the collectors. From time to time, he would influence them, and also he worked with Paul Rosenberg as well. Paul Rosenberg had become a friend of his, and Paul decided to put together the very first logical inventory of Cézanne's works, working together with Lionel Venturi. But I know that Venturi, of course, would do his own research. But the meetings were held at my grandfather's place with Paul Rosenberg. Paul Rosenberg and my grandfather wanted right of veto over the work to make sure that things would go smoothly.
As in France, as in Britain, Germany, Switzerland, America, certain collectors played an important part. I mean, we heard about Camondo this morning and Pellerin particularly.
Absolutely, a number of French collectors played important roles. Dr. Gachet, in particular, with Van Gogh, at the time when Cézanne spent 2 years approximately. He spent 2 years in Auvers-sur-Oise. So his son was just born, and he didn't want to let his father know that he was spending time with a young woman and that he just fathered a son. So he spent a couple of years in Auvers-sur-Oise, and he followed Pissarro's advice. So together with other painters, Guillaumin, etc., they spent a lot of time in the countryside between Auvers-sur-Oise and nearby towns. And on rainy days, Cézanne would come to the studio set up by Dr. Gachet in his tiny row house to paint the bouquets or bunches of flowers that were created by the doctor's wife. And many of these paintings were donated to the Dr. Gachet, and many of them are currently shown at the Musée d'Orsay. He was one of the earliest collectors of Cézanne works, and then, of course, all of his friends, also painters. Pissarro, Renoir, he has 4 paintings. It's more important as far as Renoir is concerned because Renoir was a true friend, a close friend of Cézanne's. He was also an advisor to Cézanne. He's the one who encouraged a young art dealer such as Voillard, who didn't really know what he was doing. He encouraged him to take care of Cézanne, saying, "No, but there's nobody to stand up for him and protect his interests, and yet he's the greatest of us all." So he had a lovely collection. I remember having a discussion with the granddaughter of César Heller, a friend of Monet's. César Heller had donated a work by Cézanne to his friend Monet, and she said that she went to Giverny to meet with Claude Monet. And the granddaughter was allowed by Monet to spend time in his private rooms on the first floor, and so she saw extraordinary paintings such as the Scipio Nigger, an amazing painting in the bathroom, and the other works by Cézanne were hung all around the bedroom. There was nothing by Van Gogh and nothing by Gauguin. Things were different as far as Degas was concerned. There was respect between Degas and Cézanne, but things were a little complex between them initially. I don't think Degas was very fond of Cézanne's flashy colors. Degas represented the past, where Cézanne represented the future. We're talking a clash of 2 different visions, a clash of 2 different schools of thought. But Degas was very fond of his collection and held on to it until his dying day. Who else is there? Among the painters, at a later stage, there were a lot more painters. You referred to Matisse. When we look at the 4 sculpted backs by Matisse, that stems from that small bather painting. That's extraordinary. Braque had this amazing painting, a bunch of tulips. And here's another interesting story told to me by my father. One day Braque invited him to come to see him at the studio, because at the time my father dabbled in painting, quote unquote. And so they were in the studio and they started talking. At some point, Braque grabbed his hand and he said, "Come with me, let me show you something." And he took him to his bedroom. And in the bedroom, just facing Braque's bed, there was Cézanne's still life. And he said, "See, I am paying tribute to your grandfather because I did as he did." And indeed, Paul Cézanne had received from Villard, because Cézanne was passionate about Delacroix, and so Villard had given him a huge bunch of flowers that he hung in the bathroom, in the bedroom, and there was a crucifix also on the wall. There was just two things. There was the still life by Delacroix and the crucifix, and Braque decided to do the same thing. What a lovely tribute.
As Walter was saying, he's the father of all these artists.
Absolutely. Mais il y a une chose extraordinaire, je crois que c'est le seul cas.
Yes, but what is extraordinary is that, as far as Cézanne is concerned, he died in 1906. And every well-known French painter, whether Derain, Vlaminck, Braque, the entire who's who, for an entire year, a year or two after his death, everybody painted in the style of Cézanne. They used his flashy colors and the dichotomy between green and blue and the diagonal lines. And maybe that was a way for them to try and understand what Cézanne was trying to do. And I think this is unprecedented. There aren't that many such instances in the history of art.
When you mentioned Van Gogh, I wondered, because Van Gogh's, a large amount of his work ended up in the Van Gogh Museum. Did anyone ever have the thought of Musée Cézanne? Did that ever occur? Would that have been a possibility?
To have a Musée Cézanne, no, but I think that le musée de Cézanne le plus important, c'est la Fondation Barnes.
The Barnes Foundation probably has the largest collection of Cézanne in the world. It's a fantastic collection.
Immediately after the death of Cézanne, Madame Cézanne and the fils have sold the entire collection to Vollard and to Bernheim-Jeanne about 2 weeks after his death.
C'est vrai.
So
there's no question of a Musée Cézanne.
The question could not have arisen.
No. Non, mais, pardon, je sais, par mon père, ce sont des
I know that this is something that was handed down from my father. I don't have written documents proving it. This is just hand-down information.
Tout au moins le conservateur du musée Granet avait demandé
The Granet curator had come to ask for works by Cézanne, but had he done so, then obviously works would have been given to them.
I always have to point out that in Philadelphia there are more Cézannes than in the whole of France.
Oui. Entre le musée et
You're exactly right. With the museum and the Barnes collection.
Some at the museum and some in private collections, and that's altogether more than the entire French.
Absolutely.
It's an amazing statistic.
And all the Duchamp as well.
Mais ce qui est intéressant, ce qui est amusant, je raconte toujours des petites histoires personnelles.
What's always very interesting, again, this is just a personal anecdote. At the beginning of the 60s, this is a time where I was wanting to become an expert assessor of art, and Charles Durand-Well, who is the son of Paul, was looking for a colleague, someone to work with. I go and meet him, a charming gentleman. A little chat for about 10-15 minutes, and after a while he just stops me and says, "Philippe, I'm in a bit of a bind. My family never really liked Cézanne. So how can I work with someone who goes by the name of Philippe Cézanne?" So I was a little taken aback, and I said, "Well, let me make up for mistakes of the past." Really, I say that just because it's quite surprising, because they never really liked the work of Cezanne. And if you look at the personal, private collection, there are only 3 works, 2 still lifes, which are very impressionist in their style, and a view of which is a landscape. And really, they're very easy works, if I can use that term. It's quite interesting because here we're talking about art merchants, and they sold 67 of Cezanne's works during that time. One of the sons of Paul Cézanne, I think his name was George, he was a correspondent with Barnes. And at the time, when you had a collectioner who just had on hand, or on speed dial, if you want, an art dealer, then art dealer would come and look and try and see what are the best works that you have that we can sell on the market. So these are people like Graham and Vollard, and really going to Barnes, it was the best way for the collectioner to come and see which ones they could buy. And this is exactly what Barnes tried to do later on with Paul Guillaume. And for those of you who do have the opportunity to go and see the Barnes collection, or even at the Orangerie, the Paul Guillaume collection, it's always interesting to see the relationship between the artists and the merchant on the other hand.
Contribution and insight. We just mentioned Philadelphia, and you can see a lot of art in and around Philadelphia, but you can also see a lot of Cezannes in Switzerland. Lukas, I think you've got something to say about the Swiss position.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you first and foremost for giving me the opportunity to say a few words here in this context of the Samuel Courtauld Collections exhibition. I'm the curator of the Émile Bürhle collection, and the Paris audience has right now the opportunity to go and see the collection and make their own comparisons. And I think we should really be thankful for having the opportunity to show what's similar and what's different in these collections. I should like to thank Daniella Luxembourg and Walter Feilchenfeldt to having included me here. Émile Bührle has remained somehow a bit in the shadow, because it's not only his collection which is currently to be seen on the other side of the river, so to say. It's also the fact that he has been born on the other side of 20th century history. Having been born in Germany towards the end of the 19th century, having grown up in Germany, he represents a type of collector of which rare traces have been left due to the history of the 20th century. He has never been a part of the set of collectors in the English-speaking world, in the French-speaking world, for the same reasons. I think we should... I have, of course, for obvious reasons, been asked to focus on the position of Paul Cézanne in Émile Bürhle's collection, but I should nevertheless, first of all, introduce the man here a bit. The only photograph we have from him in connection with his paintings shows Émile Bürhle, taken by an American photographer in 1954. We are very grateful, this gentleman, that he sort of coerced Bührle, who was rather shy when it came to public appearances, into posing for this rather special photograph. And already here you recognize on the lower left the picture which Bührle valued as his most important picture of the collection, Cézanne's boy with a red vest. I'll give you some figures just to explain a thing which has often made understanding of the Bührle collection a bit difficult. In fact, what we present here in Paris, 57 paintings, comes from a part 1/3 of paintings which were given to a foundation after the collector's death in 1956. Émile Bürhle died without leaving a will, without leaving any sort of instructions what he wanted to have happening to his collection. So it fell upon his family, his widow and the two children, who decided to set up a foundation, give this foundation roughly 1/3 of the paintings which Emil Bührle had collected. Within 20 years, between 1936 and his death in 1956. The foundation is currently without a home of its own. We are awaiting the completion of the extension of the Zurich Kunsthaus, currently under construction, in order to move into the new part of the public collection in Zurich. From 1960 through to 2015, the collection has been housed in a home of its own, not the home in which Emil Bührle lived. The photograph was not taken in Emil Bührle's residence, it was taken in the house which served Emil Bührle, the neighboring house, which served him basically as a storage room for his collection. I found it interesting to understand that Samuel Courtauld was described here as someone who followed his likings, who would not really approach collecting with a systematic mind. This is indeed very different from Emil Bührle's collecting. He was a collector who set out to assemble a selection of paintings which would allow to tell people his own art history, the selection he had made out of a larger, of the general European art history. In fact, there is another similarity this time with Samuel Courtauld, insofar as the beginnings of Emil Bührle's collection were also based upon a sort of a revelatory moment. In Emil Bührle's case, this was the moment when, as a 23-year-old man, as a student of art history at the University of Freiburg in Breisgau in the southern part of Germany, he was born in 1890 in Pforzheim nearby, where he enrolled in classes of art history, and from where he set out to make a travel to Berlin, where he visited the National Gallery. And it was in the National Gallery that he, for the very first time in his life, saw paintings by French Impressionism. And we have seen a photograph of the gentleman who was responsible for that, Hugo von Tschudi. These acquisitions, of course, at that time had steered quite a bit of controversy. The Kaiser himself was not amused to see French paintings hanging in the German National Gallery, which led eventually to Hugo von Tschudi being dismissed and taken up in Munich for a short while. He died very young then. So when Emil Bührle, for the first time, saw these Impressionists, of course, as a young man, he was then 23 years old, he was also familiar with the controversy surrounding these paintings. And that, I'm sure, was also one of the reasons why this first impression kept him going. He was not born into wealth. He came from modest origins. So it took, in fact, the upheavals of 20th century to redirect his life, to turn a student of art history into one of the major industrialists of Europe. Emil Bührle first went to World War I, where he served in the German army for 5 years. He came back. He was then sent by his father-in-law, he had in the meantime married well in Magdeburg, he was sent by his father-in-law to Switzerland and established himself in Switzerland as a producer of arms. For the first years, the business went slow. As World War II approached, business all started to accelerate. And in 1937, for the first time, really major commissions came in for cannons for the British and the French army, because both sides had completely stopped rearming and had sort of been overtaken by the Germans, who had in the meantime started rearmament rather aggressively under the Nazi government. That was at the basis of Emil Bührle's collection. It allowed him to start out buying, first of all, French paintings, and now we see him actually acquiring in the course of the years, in a very systematic manner, paintings which allow to cover all different genres in the art of Paul Cézanne. So we find figure painting, we find landscapes, we find still lifes, we find this figure painting purchased in summer 1951, the very moment when the acquisition potential of Emil Bührle started to change. It was the moment when his business resumed potential after World War II, and when, for the first time, Emil Bührle had access to an international art market. So far, he had been limited to what he could buy in Switzerland throughout the war. So apart from a figure like the Jardinier Vallier, we have in the Bührle holdings landscapes by Cézanne, we have still lifes by Cézanne. Here I should add that in fact we were very happy to receive recently this still life from Cézanne's earliest period, all the more so since when the separation of the collection in order to set up the foundation was made in 1960, some compromises had to be made, and since both of the major still lifes by Cézanne were hanging in the family's dining room, they were, for understandable reasons, not available for a donation to the foundation. All the more we are happy that the son of Emil Bührle bequeathed to the foundation a group of 10 paintings from his father's collection, among which that painting, that early still life by Cézanne. This is, of course, the moment also to remind you that Emil Bührle, in his collecting, was actually sort of a latecomer. The most intense period of his acquisitions were in the early 1950s. Now, with that, he is situated, in a way, in the middle generation of 20th century modern art collecting, which is not the same as collecting of modern art. The history of modern art collecting starts, in fact, if you want to say so, with old master collections before World War I. Thus, that was the ruling pattern of the time. The very wealthy collectors went after the old masters, which remained at the top of the market right through the 1950s. In the years between the war followed the next generation, a generation of collecting French Impressionists and centering collections around French Impressionism, such as Samuel Courtauld did it in England, such as many American collectors did it in the United States. And this is, in fact, this pattern that is followed by Emil Bührle. He was also at the middle of three major Swiss collections of Western art. The Oskar Reinhardt collection, already mentioned here, a contemporary to the Courtauld, built up in the 1920s, followed one generation later by Emil Bührle, built up in the 1950s, and followed yet another time, 30 years later, by the collection of Ernst, who came into being as of 1980 onwards, when Ernst started to transform himself step by step from the marchand to becoming the amateur. In the Emil Bührle collection, we find, of course, therefore, many paintings with interesting provenances. We find paintings coming from Paul Gachet's collection, such as the small still life, which I've just shown you. Cornelis Hogendijk, a Dutch collector who was a very early client of Ambroise Vollard until his early death in 1911, was a former owner of the Mont de Sangle, which I've shown you. Then the probably most noble provenance of any painting in the Bührle collection, the already shown portrait of Madame Cézanne, being basically the founding picture of the Stein collection, and thereby really at the very beginning of one of the most important collections in modern art, in the history of modern taste at all. It's interesting to note that when Emmy Bührle purchased the painting in 1952, he knew the name of the former owner. Emmy Bührle had hired a private curator for his collection as of 1948, based upon some bad experiences he had gone through whilst having purchased looted works of art during World War II in Switzerland. So that faced him with the importance of doing proper research in provenances. That's why he hired a curator. And so we know that on the inventory card of Madame Cézanne, there is duly noted a former ownership by Gertrude Stein. But believe me, I don't think that Emmy Bührle had any idea who Gertrude Stein was. He was living on the other side of history in the 20th century. He knew English very well. He had studied English, but I dare say that he wasn't really aware of the importance of the previous owner of Madame Cézanne. Then the supreme achievement of Emmy Bührle's acquisitions in the field of Cézanne, The Boy with the Red Vest. Again, a picture which brought a history of former and very prominent ownership into Emmy Bührle's collection. The Boy with the Red Vest had been a part of the collection of Marcel Nemes, a Hungarian collector, whose collection was sold at auction in Paris in 1913. At that auction in 1913, Gottlieb Friedrich Reber purchased the painting. He kept the painting till 30 years later, when Emmy Bührle was able to acquire it. Reber at the time had been the most important owner of works by Pablo Picasso of his own time. From the 1920s onwards, he had transformed what had been an Impressionist collection to becoming a Cubist collection. Now, Gottlieb Friedrich Reber was again one of the collectors who had been born on the wrong side of history. Being a German, he had no chance to sell his Cubist paintings out of Switzerland, where he was living, when the Second World War started, and that led to his eventually being completely broke, selling the last remaining work, The Boy with the Red Vest, to Emmy Bührle. The third one of the important figure paintings, the largest self-portrait which Cézanne ever painted, and which Emmy Bührle had the chance to acquire from the artist's family soon after the death of your grandfather, the son of Paul Cézanne. For Emmy Bührle, it was quite clear that Paul Cézanne was the most important painter in his collection. We have very little documents telling about the ideas, the motivations which led Emmy Bührle through his collecting. But we do have one text which he formulated in order to give a conference in Zurich in 1954, where he spoke about the origin and the growth of his collection. And that was really a conference with a purely intellectual approach. There, Emmy Bührle tells how he went about building up his collection. And he pointed out that for him, among the three fathers of modern art, Van Gogh, Gauguin, and Cézanne, Cézanne was by far the greatest. And he pointed out to the trilogy of portraits he had succeeded in acquiring, and that was the reason why in the museum of the Foundation, where the Foundation's holdings were shown to the public from 1960 until 2015, we always combined the three portraits by Cézanne on the same wall, sort of also an homage to the collector. Interestingly enough, and with that I should like to come to the end of this brief glance about Bührle and Cezanne. Interestingly enough, we find along the large and important masterpieces a series of smaller works, and that is now a very characteristic approach we see in Emil Bührle's collecting. He was interested in giving a survey of the entire production of the artist. Therefore, it is not by coincidence that at the very end of his collecting, shortly before his death in 1956, as a second last painting by Cezanne, this early work enters Emil Bührle's collection. And we have, in fact, the opportunity to follow the artist's entire career, step by step, throughout the decades, starting with the beginning, now here, Impressionist Cezanne, ending with the Cezanne landscapes from the mature period. So here we go. We have a collector really in sync with his own time. These are the 1950s. This is the moment when art is actually seen under the premises of progress, and where art in general needs a progress, modern art needs a progress, then obviously the leading figures need to show the same progress in their own creation. So we find this survey. And interestingly enough, with that I close my remarks, it was seen by his contemporaries. The already mentioned author of the first catalogue, Raisonnée, when asked to do a contribution to the first catalogue of the Bürhle collection, he pointed out, here we go, we have a collector who has a sense for the history of art, along with a sense for the creation of a single individual artist.
Well, thank you, Lukas. In Emil Bührle, as with Samuel Courtauld, we have a man who was of his time, but also had a specific vision of what art was, and particularly what Cezanne was. And just as we were saying earlier on, London sees Cezanne and post-impressionism through the eyes of Samuel Courtauld. Still, I take it Zurich sees those areas through the eyes of Bührle. Is that?
One must point out that there was a basic difference between the situation in which Samuel Courtauld set out to collect French Impressionism and the situation in which Emil Bührle set out to do the same thing. Whereas Samuel Courtauld had clearly an educational mission, Emil Bührle was operating in a country which was one for French Impressionism. When Bührle started collecting French art in Switzerland, he was one of many collectors. I was very interested in learning just now that the first Cezanne in Great Britain obviously was purchased in 1911. Now in Switzerland, the first Cezanne was purchased in 1908. So in close connection, of course, with what was happening in Germany, Swiss collectors from the German-speaking part of the country set out to collect French Impressionism very early on.
At this point, we're almost at the end of our allotted time, but I wonder if anyone in the audience would like to take the opportunity to ask questions of anybody on our panel. It's an extraordinary opportunity to ask experts, Philippe Cézanne, representing the Cezanne family. Does anyone have a question? Yes? I think somebody's bringing you a microphone. Just a moment.
I wanted to know if the idea of the logical inventory would be touched upon. Either later or now.
He can't.
You want me to speak English?
Say it in English and I'll...
Yeah, I was asking whether we were talking about catalogue raisonnée now or in the next sequence.
Is you talking about the catalogue raisonnée at the present or in the future?
I'm not supposed to talk about the catalogue raisonnée.
No, I thought it belonged to the conference also in the next future. No? So can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Yeah. Je vais le dire en français. Je me présente, je vais le catalogue raisonné de Degas.
I am in charge of the logical inventory of Degas, which has been online for 10 years now. I would just like to say that the Cezanne logical inventory on time, which has been online for some years now, had a considerable impact on my decision to have an entirely digital logical inventory for Degas, because the digital logical inventory enables us to have a completely new outlook on artists and their careers and their lives. For example, for Degas, I discovered that I was able to see that he was presented in some 2,000 different exhibitions around the world throughout history. So it's interesting to be able to trace the different acquisitions of museums and the history of each work. And that's why the online version is probably so interesting in being able to break down the history of works and artists. And it's interesting to see this move from paper to the online format, because the digital world really helps us see the art world in a completely different light. What should I say? I think you and I need to speak together. We need to have a chat, a head-to-head.
Yeah, I was saying that to let people know that
our man in Paris.
Hello, that the digital publication today brings a new light, a new vision on the art history. And now, I mean that the curators, art researchers, art historian, and expert should deal now with the system which doesn't cancel the paper publications, but add to much knowledge of what you used to have before. And today I'm really satisfied to follow the Cezanne catalog, digital catalog that you started with a few years ago. And I know that the Wittgenstein Foundation decided to publish now, to stop publication on paper and to publish online the catalogue raisonnée. Okay. It's great.
I think, does anyone else...
I'm not in the Wittgenstein regime, by the way.
Does anyone else have a question they'd like to... Is there any other? Daniella, do you wish to bring the conversation to the conclusion?
I
would like to thank everyone. Any last questions? Last final remarks? In that case, I would like to thank Paul Cézanne. It was fantastic having you here with us. It was rather unique. I would like to thank Walter Feilchenfeldt for such your fantastic work that you have done.
Ernst Vegelin for
the work that the Courtauld Gallery has done, because without you, none of this would have been possible. Lukas Gloor as well. Thank you very much for the fantastic description that you gave us of the Bürhle collection.
Martin Gayford,
thank you very much for a curious contemporary outlook on the works of Cezanne. We will be back in 5 minutes or straight away? 5 minutes. We will continue in 5 minutes for the final section, beyond the private collection of the Courtauld Institute. Back in 5. Thank you.